Reading French Cinema, The First Wave, 1915 through 1929 by Richard Abel, published by Princeton University Press. The Commercial Narrative Film, Introduction. What is the best way to come to grips with the hundreds of commercial French narrative films from 1915 to 1929? That question depends on another prior question. What, to the French, exactly was a commercial film? The one anticipates the answer to the other. To be commercial, paradoxically, a film need not to have been profitable. If profitability were the issue, then Rene Clair's Paris Quai d'Art 1924 would be commercial, whereas Aubert's Extravaganza Salammbô 1925 would not. Similarly, the means of production financing hardly provided a clear-cut criterion. Many of the films one could include as part of a narrative avant-garde, for instance, were actually initiated or underwritten as commercial projects by the major production companies, e.g. Abel Gance's La Rue 1922 and Napoleon 1927, Marcel Laherbier El Dorado 1921 and L'Argent 1929, Germaine Dulac's La Suriante, Madame Baudet 1923, Jean Epstein's Cour Fidèle 1923, and even Carl Dreyer's La Passion de Jeanne d'Arc 1928. Several filmmakers from the period offer a way to resolve these contradictions. Quote, in cinema jargon, end quote, quipped Jean Renoir, quote, a commercial film is not one which necessarily makes money, but one in which is conceived and executed according to the principles of businessmen, end quote. But what were those principles? In one of the earliest books on French film, La Cinema 1919, Henry Diamant Berger argued that first, the producer, not the filmmaker, made the crucial decisions that determined a film's production. Henry Fescourt, one of Cine Roman's most consistently successful directors, agreed, quote, with few exceptions, end quote, it was not the filmmaker who chose the subject. In most cases, that was the prerogative of the producer, end quote. Second, the essential element of a film for the producer was the scenario or story. In fact, said Diamant Berger, quote, it was the film, end quote. And what kinds of stories did he tend to choose? Here is Fescourt again, quote, the story most crammed with events or spectacular elements, a story with a recognizable title, which had already garnered accolades in the theater or in the bookstalls, end quote. Diamant Berger was more precise, even if, quote, roughly and childishly defined, end quote, such stories were formulas or genres that could be duplicated for mass circulation, exactly as were the products in, quote, a grocery or lingerie shop, end quote. As a site of pleasure, therefore, the French cinema seemed to attract and hold its audience, not with the images of popular stars, which was much more common in the United States, but with the familiarity or notoriety of a film subject or story. These statements suggest that the best way to analyze the commercial French narrative films of the period is to consider them within the framework of a loosely defined genre system in French film production. Such an approach offers more than the convenience of labeling. It imposes certain questions. What film genres dominated French cinema? Question mark. What were the material conditions of each genre's development? Question mark. What were the privileged conventions of its form? Its fundamental structural components of character, setting, action, style? Question mark. What was the social or ideological function of its tacit contract with the audience? Question mark. Which specific films were most characteristic of a genre, which were most popular and profitable, and which were especially effective either in resolving a genre's representation of cultural conflicts or in changing its conventions? Question mark. Finally, which genres in particular provided the context of accepted conventions within which and against which the narrative avant-garde tended to position itself? Question mark. The distribution of film genres within the French film industry seems to have its origins in the kinds of films produced on a regular basis prior to the Great War, when the cinema was establishing itself as a form of spectacle entertainment. According to George Sadoul, by 1908, Pathé Frères had, quote, defined, classified, organized, and developed, end quote, a catalog of film forms that would consistently attract a mass clientele. Most important of these were, quote, the newsreels, quote, dramatic and realistic scenes, end quote, biblical stories, end quote, and comic films with their, quote, wild and woolly, end quote, chases, end of quote. Several others associated with Georges Méliès had already declined in popularity and nearly disappeared: the trick film and the fairy tale or fantasy. During this period, two of Pathé's products underwent significant changes. The comic film, of course, came to focus on the misadventures of a single clown or comic type. André Gide, Prince Rigaudin, Max Linder. The, quote, dramatic and realist scene, end quote, on the other hand, became a label for several different kinds of films that reflected division within French society. There were, quote, social, end quote, films about the working classes, quote, sentimental dramas, end quote, about the bourgeoisie, and crime films, quote, dramas of passion, end quote, involving either class as well as bands of outsiders. These latter films provided the basis for the rapid emergence of the series film and the serial. About the same time, one last format was tested successfully: the film Dart and SCAGL, adaptations of literary classics, especially those from the theater. During the war, in the face of competition from the American cinema, which threatened the viability of much of their production, the French abandoned the comic short almost altogether to Sennett, Chaplin, Arbuckle, Lloyd, and Keaton, and concentrated most of their production efforts on the serial and particular kinds of feature-length films. The popularity of the serial quickly led to a standardized format of half-hour episodes projected weekly over a period of several months, a format that could handle stories of crime, sentimental melodrama, and historical adventure and intrigue. In contrast to the serial, the term grand film designated a film of at least an hour in length, designed to be shown complete in a single seance or performance. By 1920, the average French feature was anywhere from 4 to 6 reels or 1,200 to 1,800 meters long. Since the format encompassed a variety of genres that shifted in priority as the decade advanced, their development demands more specific attention. Prior to the war, the first feature films had been literary adaptations, many of them drawn from theatrical productions. However, by the war's end, the plays that now were turned into film scenarios tended to be modern or contemporary, particularly boulevard melodramas, typifying a shift away from the classic dramas which had already been pretty well rummaged through. Simultaneously, a further shift was underway to film adaptations of novels and short stories, especially 19th century realist fiction. During the early years of the 20s, therefore, the bourgeois melodrama in the realist film, followed by minor genres such as the fantasy, the Arabian Nights adventure story, and the boulevard comedy, had precedence. These were superseded rather quickly, however, by larger and longer superproductions. After the phenomenal success of Les Trois Mousquetaires, 1921 through 1922, Les Opprimes, 1923, and Königsmarck, 1923, the French turned more and more to large scale historical reconstructions, which soon became the quote top line end quote of production. As the nation rebuilt the northern provinces as the nation rebuilt the northern provinces devastated by the war, so too did the French so too did the film industry reimagine and thus give representation to ideologically significant figures and events in certain periods of French history. The genre was challenged in turn around 1926 through 1927 by the development of studio spectaculars and a generalized modern European decor. These films of contemporary life played out in the new chic restaurants, nightclubs, theaters, and resorts sought to position the French within an emerging worldwide consumer society. When the industry finally changed over to talking films in 1929, the preference for adaptations from fiction ebbed once again in favor of contemporary theatrical productions. This brief overview of French film genres provides a point of departure. The classification schema I offer is obviously tentative in the absence of much prior research, and it is perhaps less than consistent. But then my purpose does not include a theoretical consideration of genre. As Henry Diamant Berger confessed, quote, most of the really successful films prove the instability of any rigid classification, end quote. Still, the schema can be valuable if it helps to mark out areas of intertextual relations among disparate films and to suggest ways that the films may be read contextually within the structures and process of French culture. And I was reading the introduction to the commercial narrative film in French cinema, The First Wave, 1915 through 1929, by Richard Abel, published by Princeton University Press.